On the 4th of October in the year 2009, a man with 3 degrees in entomology stood in a gravel lot in Bremer County, Wisconsin, and told a 41-year-old woman that the $140 she had just spent was the most generous donation the county landfill had ever received. He said it kindly. That was the part that stung. Royce Tamblyn was not a cruel man, and he did not raise his voice, and he smiled at her the way a doctor smiles at a patient who has decided to treat a fever with prayer. The barn she had bought was a charred shell. The roof had burned through 2 winters before. The whole property had gone for the price of a used chest freezer, because no one in the 4 counties around could see a single reason to want it. She wanted it. 11 years later, on a morning in 2020, when a sickness none of them had a name for yet was emptying the highways, a buyer from a breeding cooperative in 3 states wrote a number on a check and slid it across a kitchen table for a single-mated queen bee and her daughters. The woman who took the check did not celebrate. She set it under a canning jar so the draft from the door would not move it, and she went back out to the bees. This is the story of the space between those 2 numbers. It is the story of a burned barn, a cellar nobody opened, a line of insects that should have been dead, and the gap between what a man trained to measure could measure and what was actually in front of him. Which brings us to Marie Okerlund and the $140 and what was waiting under the floor. She was known in Tannersville for 2 things. She kept bees that other people could not keep alive, and she said less in a year than most people said in a week. Her grandfather had come over from a valley above Voss with 2 suitcases and a frame hive packed in straw, and the family had kept bees on the same river-bottom ground in the driftless for 3 generations. Through foul brood and through bad winters and through the year the price of honey fell below the price of the jars. Marit had learned to read a comb, the way some people read weather. She could lift a frame into the light, tilt it, and tell you in a breath whether the colony was queen-right, how old the brood was, whether the workers were carrying the early signs of trouble. She did not have a degree. She had 40 winters of her own and 3 generations of winters behind her, and she trusted them more than she trusted anything printed. The trouble, when it came from a mite the size of a pinhead. Let me tell you about the mite, because the whole story turns on it, and most people have never had it explained plainly. There is a parasite, a reddish-brown thing roughly the size of the head of a straight pin, that fastens onto a honeybee and feeds on the fat stored in its body. It had reached the American Midwest in the late 1980s, and by the time Merritt bought the barn, it had killed more managed colonies than every blizzard and drought in beekeeping history combined. The standard answer was chemistry. You treated. You put miticide strips into the hive on a schedule, in the spring and again in the fall, and you killed the mites before the mites killed the bees. It worked mostly the way a crutch works. It kept the patient upright. It also did something quieter that very few people were measuring in 2009. Every colony that survived only because a man dosed it on a calendar never had to learn to survive on its own. The bees that would have died, the bees that lived because of the strip, not because of anything in themselves. 3 generations of that, and you had built an animal that could not last a season without a pharmacy. Merritt had stopped treating her bees in 2003. She had watched 4 out of every 5 colonies die that first hard winter and the winter after that. And she had not flinched because she was not trying to keep bees alive. She was trying to find the ones that did not need her. The few that came through because something in them resisted the mite on its own, and those were the only ones she bred from. Survivors raising survivors. It is the oldest idea in animal husbandry and the slowest, and it had cost her almost everything she had twice over. By 2009, she had 11 colonies that had not seen a chemical strip in 6 years and were stronger every spring. 11 was not a living. 11 was a stubbornness she could not afford and would not quit, which brings us to the auction and the barn and the $140. The property had belonged to a woman named Esther Knutson, who had died at 91 the winter before, with no children and no will anyone could find. Esther had kept bees, too, far back before Marit was born, and then she had stopped, and the place had gone quiet and gray, and finally caught fire from old wiring one January night, and burned half down before the Tannersville volunteers could get a truck up a lane through the snow. What was left was 11 acres of river bottom, a farmhouse with a sound kitchen and a ruined upstairs, and the barn, which was a black skeleton standing in a field of burdock. The county put it up to settle the unpaid taxes. The sale was held in the gravel lot of the old creamery on a cold, bright Saturday, and maybe 30 people came, most of them for the parcels of cropland that went in the same sale for real money. Debut Cardwell ran the auction off the tailgate of his truck. When he got to the Knutson place, he read the description in a flat voice: the burned barn, the damaged house, the 11 acres of bottom ground too wet to plow, and he asked for an opening bid, almost as a courtesy. Nobody moved. A man near the front laughed. Bo dropped the call to $100, then to $50, and Marit, standing at the back in her grandfather's canvas coat, lifted 2 fingers and said $140, and the lot was hers before anyone could be bothered to bid against her. It was less than she spent on hive boxes most years. People turned to look at her, and then they turned away. The way you look away from someone who has made a small, embarrassing mistake in public. Royce Tamblyn did not turn away. He came and found her by her truck. He was a research entomologist with the state, a tall, neat, fluent man of 50 with reading glasses pushed up into iron-gray hair, and he had spent a career studying exactly the mite that was eating Marit's profession alive. He genuinely admired beekeepers. He thought of himself as their ally, and in his own mind, he had come to the sale for a different parcel and had recognized her because she was a small legend in a small world, the woman who refused to treat her hives. He congratulated her on the purchase, with a warmth that had a hook in it. "Ah, you know there's nothing there, Marit," he said. "That ground's been bee-empty 30 years. Esther stopped before either of us started. He glanced at the burned barn on the horizon and shook his head, not unkindly. $140 for a chimney and a swamp. I'd have let it go to the county." "I know what I bought," she said. "I know you think you do," he smiled. He pulled off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, a habit he had when he was about to be patient with someone. "Look, your survivor stock is a beautiful idea. I mean that you're selecting on 11 colonies. That's not breeding program. That's a hobby with a high mortality rate. The genetics that beat the mite, when we find them, we'll find them in a controlled cross with 10,000 colonies and a budget, not on a river bottom with one woman and a smoker." He put the glasses back on. "You're going to bury yourself out here. I'd hate to watch it." She did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with a man like Royce only gave him more surface to be reasonable at. She thanked him for his concern, which she did not want, and she drove home, and the next morning she came back to the burned barn with a crowbar and a flashlight, because there was one thing about the Knutson place that no one at the auction had known, and she had only half remembered. Esther Knutson had overwintered bees in a cellar. Let me tell you about cellaring bees because it is a lost practice, and it is the hinge of everything that came after. Before chemical treatment, before the package bee trade that lets a beekeeper simply order new bees through the mail every spring, the old northern beekeepers had a hard problem. Their bees had to survive winters that ran 40 below, and many did not. Some of the oldest hands solved it by moving the colonies underground. In late fall, when the bees had clustered and gone quiet, they carried the hives down into a root cellar dug deep enough that the ground itself held the temperature near 40 degrees all winter, dark and still and steady. The bees in that even cold burned almost no honey, raised no brood, and waited. In spring, the keeper carried them back up into the light. A cellar like that, dug right, was a piece of agricultural engineering as fine as any barn, and almost no one built them anymore, and almost no one remembered which farms had them. Merritt remembered because her grandfather had spoken of Esther once, years before, with the particular respect one craftsman holds for another. He had said the Knutson place had a wintering cellar that ran back into the hillside under the barn, and that Esther's bees had been famous in the small way bees can be famous for coming through winters that killed everyone else's. And then she had grown old and stopped, and the bees were gone, and the cellar with them, and that was 30 years and more before the auction. The cellar door was where her grandfather had said it would be, set into the hillside behind the burned barn, half buried under a drift of dead burdock and a fallen section of charred siding. The fire had not reached it. The door was oak, swollen shut, banded with iron, and it took her the better part of an hour with the crowbar to break the swelling and haul it open. Cold air came out even and old, smelling of earth and beeswax, and something sweeter under that. She turned on the flashlight and went down 7 stone steps into the dark. What she found below changed the arithmetic of the rest of her life, though she did not know it yet, standing on the bottom step with her breath showing in the beam. Hives, 11 of them, the old-fashioned kind, double-deep boxes gone soft and gray with age, set on a long wooden rack against the back wall of a stone room dug 40 feet into the hill. The room? The temperature, she would learn, never moved more than a few degrees across a year. Esther had wintered her last colonies down here, and then, too old to carry them back up, had simply left them, sealed the door, and let the place hold its breath. Merritt moved the light along the rack, and her chest went tight because she was looking at a tomb. 11 dead colonies, 30 years gone, the comb black, the boxes rotting, nothing left but the ghost of an apiary that had once been famous. Then she heard it, a sound she knew better than her own pulse, low and steady, coming from the box on the end. The hum of a living cluster. She had to sit down on the cold steps. She turned off the flashlight without meaning to and sat in the dark with the sound, and then she turned it back on and went to the box and put her bare hand flat against the wood. And the wood was warm, not warm like the sun, warm like a body. 11 boxes and 10 of them tombs, and the last one alive. It should not have been possible, and let me tell you plainly why, because this is the part that makes the whole thing matter and not merely a sweet accident. A colony cannot survive 30 years sealed underground. A queen lives 2 or 3 years. The workers live weeks in summer, months in winter. For a colony to have been alive in that cellar in 2009, it had to have raised a new queen, and that queen had to have mated, And her daughters had to have raised another, generation after generation, 30 times over, in total darkness, with no keeper, no treatment, no spring flight to fresh forage. It had to have done the one thing the package bee industry had spent 2 decades insisting bees could no longer do. It had to have survived the might, the winter, and the long dark entirely on its own for 3 decades, while every treated colony in the state would have collapsed in a single season without a man in his calendar. Merritt had paid $140 for a burned barn, and underneath it she had found the one thing Royce had built a career around looking for and was certain did not exist on a river bottom. She did not tell anyone, not at first. Let me be honest with you about why. Because it is the kind of small thing that decides a life. She did not stay quiet to set a trap or stage a reveal. She stayed quiet because she was afraid she was wrong, afraid the cluster was some fluke that would die in a week and prove the laughing man at the auction right, and she could not bear to be looked away from twice. So she carried that one living box up into the light herself, slowly, on a board, sweating in the October cold, easing it up the 7 stone steps one at a time, so the cluster would not break apart in her hands. She set it in a sheltered corner of the river bottom behind the windbreak of box elder her grandfather had planted, and she watched it through the fall, and it did not die. Most evenings she walked out to it before dark and crouched in the grass and simply listened, the way she had listened in the cellar, and the box answered her, low and steady, every night. The cluster was small and dark, the bees a deep mahogany color she had never seen, and they were calm on the comb in a way that unsettled her, gentle as old dogs, hardly bothering to look up when she pulled a frame. They took the late goldenrod and the aster and packed it tight and capped it pale, working without hurry, as if they had nowhere they would rather be. When she finally cracked the box fully open on a warm afternoon in the second week of November, she found the queen, long and dark and unhurried, moving across the comb with a slow certainty that made the workers part around her. Merritt lifted the frame into the light and tilted it the way she had tilted 10,000 frames before it, reading the brood pattern cell by cell, the eggs standing upright in the bottoms, the larvae pearled and even the capped brood solid edge to edge with no scattered gaps. She read what she had spent 6 hard years and almost everything she owned trying to breed written plain in the cells. In front of her, the colony was clean, not low, not managed down, clean. She named the line for the woman who had left it, the survivor stock from the cellar. The bees no one had tended for 30 years became, in Merritt's mouth, and then in the counties, the Knudsen bees. The winter of 2010 was the test, and let me tell you what happened, because it is where the slow part of the story begins, and the slow part is the true part. Merritt grafted from that dark old queen. Grafting, if you have never seen it, is the patient heart of bee breeding. You take a single just-hatched larva, a thing smaller than a grain of rice on the tip of a fine tool, and you transfer it into a cup, in a hive full of nurses with no queen of their own, and those nurses, desperate, raise that larva into a queen. From one good mother you can make 50 daughters in a season. Merritt made daughters from the cellar queen and crossed them with her own survivor, drones, the 11th stubborn colony she had carried through 6 years, and she watched the crosses through the winter, and almost all of them lived. Not most. Almost all. Bees that had never seen a chemical strip, coming through a driftless winter at rates the treated outfits could not touch. By the spring of 2012, she had 90 colonies. By 2014, she had 200. and beekeepers from outside the county had begun to drive in quietly, the way people come, to a thing they are not sure they believe. She sold queens. She would not ship a queen. She had not raised from a mother that had survived 2 winters untreated, and that discipline meant she could never make as many as people wanted, and the waiting list grew. She charged what the queens were worth, which was several times the price of an ordinary mail-order queen, and the people who bought them came back the next year and bought more because their hives lived. Royce heard about it the way a careful man hears about a rumor that offends him. He did not believe it. He could not, without abandoning 20 years of his own good work, and he was not a man who abandoned things lightly. He drove out to the river bottom in the summer of 2014, ostensibly to be collegial, and he stood at the edge of Merritt's bee yard in clean boots and looked at 200 living colonies on ground he had told her was worthless, and a muscle worked in his jaw. He asked her, with real scientific hunger under the skepticism, where the foundation stock had come from. She told him the truth, the cellar, the 30 years, the dead beekeeper, the one box that hummed. He listened to all of it, and then he shook his head slowly, and what he said next was the most honest thing he ever said to her, and the most wrong. "It's contamination, Merritt." He said it gently, the way he said everything. "A feral swarm moved into that cellar 3, 4 years ago, not 30. A colony does not survive 30 years. Sealed underground, you know that. You've built something real here. I'm not denying the bees are alive, but the story you're telling yourself about them, the 30 years, that woman's line, that's the part that isn't science. That's the part you want to be true." He pulled off his glasses, cleaned them. "I'd hate to see you stake your name on a story when the bees themselves are the real thing." Quote, he believed it completely. And he had built, around his disbelief, an active and well-funded defense because he did not merely doubt Marit Åkerlund. He set out to be right about her in public. The conventional path needs a face, and in this county, his name was Lon Statler, and he ran the largest commercial operation in 3 counties, 4,000 colonies, a migratory outfit that wintered bees in Texas and trucked them north for the basswood and clover flow. Lon was a good operator and a tireless one, and he treated his bees 4 times a year on the most modern schedule the state recommended. The schedule Royce himself had helped design. Lon thought Merritt's untreated bees were a menace. An untreated yard in the conventional view was a mite bomb, a reservoir that would collapse and rain parasites onto every clean operation downwind. Royce shared that view, and in 2015, the 2 of them took it to the county. They were not villains. I want to be careful here because it would be easy and false to make them villains. Lon had 4,000 colonies and a payroll and a loan against every box, and a real collapse would ruin him. And he had watched bees die for 30 years and had every reason to fear a yard that broke the rules. Royce had spent his life trying to save the same bees Marit was saving by a method he had proven, and she rejected, and her success, if it was real, did not just challenge his data. It suggested his whole approach had been treating a symptom and breeding weakness, while the cure was a thing you found by letting bees die until the right ones stopped dying. No careful man gives that up to a woman with a crowbar and a story about a cellar, so they did what reasonable people do. They pushed for a county apiary inspection ordinance, a rule that any operation over a certain size be inspected, and if mite counts ran above a threshold, be required to treat. Aimed, everyone understood, at 1 yard on 1 river bottom. The hearing was held in the Tannersville Town Hall in March of 2016, and most of the county came because by then Marit's bees were a thing people argued about over coffee. Royce spoke first and spoke well. He laid out the science, the might, the reservoir effect, the threat to operations like lawns, the responsible necessity of inspection and, where needed, treatment. He was fluent and fair, and he never once raised his voice, and he called Marit's program in front of her neighbors a boutique liability. Those were his words. He said her bees were a beautiful experiment that the county could not afford to let endanger the people who actually made a living from honey. He said it the way he had said everything to her since the auction, with a warmth that left no place to stand. Then Leon stood up, red in the face and plain, turning his cap in his big cracked hands, and said it less kindly. He had not meant to speak. He had come to listen, and the listening had filled him up until it spilled. He said she was going to kill his bees with her stubbornness and her story, and that he had 4,000 colonies and a family and a note at the bank, and that every one of those colonies was $1,000 he owed somebody, and that he could not afford one woman's hobby a half-mile upwind of his wintering yard. He said he had buried more dead bees than this whole room had ever kept. His voice broke on the word family, and he stopped, and he sat down hard, and he did not look at Marit again for the rest of the night. The man was frightened, and his fear was real, and it was aimed at the wrong target. And that is the saddest kind of fear there is. Marit had the right to speak last. She stood up in her grandfather's coat, and she did not give a speech, because she did not have one in her and would not have given it if she had. She said 3 things. She said her bees had not been treated in 13 years. She said anyone who wanted to could come count the mites in her yard against the mites in any treated yard in the county on the same day with the same method, and she said she would abide by the count. Then she sat down. The ordinance passed anyway. The county adopted the inspection rule that spring, and the count Marit had offered was scheduled for that fall, run by the state, which meant run by Royce. He would inspect her yard himself. If her mite counts came in over the threshold, she would be ordered to treat, and treating. For Marit was not a fine or an inconvenience. It was the end. A single round of miticide would erase 13 years of selection in an afternoon, because she could no longer claim a queen had survived untreated if she had dosed the yard. The line she had found in the cellar and bred up from one humming box would, for the purposes of the only thing that gave it worth, be dead. Royce did not want to end her. He believed sincerely that the count would simply show what he already knew, and that the kindest thing was to make her face it. The count was set for October. And here the story tightens. Because the thing that actually settled it was not the count, and it was not the hearing, and it was nothing Marit said or did. It was the weather, and the calendar, and the mite itself, doing in the open what Marit had been telling people it would do for 13 years. Let me tell you what happened in the bee yards of the upper Midwest in the late summer of 2016. Because it is a real mechanism and it is the verdict of the whole story. The mite that year hit a wall the chemists had been dreading. Resistance. The same way bacteria learn to shrug off an antibiotic that is used too long, the mites in the region had been bred by 20 years of the very treatment schedule Royce designed to survive the chemical. The most used miticide in the state stopped working. It had been weakening for a few seasons, but in 2016 it failed, outright, across a wide band of the country, and the colonies that had been kept alive only by that chemical, that had never been selected to resist anything themselves, met a might they could no longer be protected from. They came apart. Landstadler lost 2,700 colonies between August and November, 2,700 out of 4,000. He treated on schedule, the modern schedule, and the strips did nothing, and the mites overran the brood, and the bees that emerged were crippled, wings shriveled, and the foragers failed to come home, and box after box went from booming to a handful of dead bees on the bottom board in 3 weeks. It was the worst regional collapse anyone in the county had seen, and it fell hardest precisely on the best-run conventional operations, the ones that had followed the recommendations to the letter, because they were the ones whose bees had been kept furthest from ever having to save themselves. Merritt lost 9 colonies out of 240 that fall. 9. I want to set that number down by itself, the way the people in the county set it down that winter, because it landed with a force out of all proportion to its size. 2,700 against 9. The man who had done everything right, ruined. The woman who had done the one thing everyone told her was reckless, untouched. Her untreated bees, raised from a line that had survived 30 years in the dark, precisely because no chemical had ever stood between them and the parasite, did not need the chemical that failed because they had never been allowed to depend on it. They met the resistant mite, the only way that finally works, which is by being themselves resistant. The Count Royce was scheduled to run on Merritt's yard in October, never happened in the way the ordinance imagined. He came out because he was a thorough man and the schedule was the schedule, and he brought his sampling jars and his alcohol wash and his clipboard, and he stood in a yard of 231 living colonies on the first cold morning of fall, while his own state's apiaries and Lawns empire lay in ruins behind him, and he ran the count. He pulled 300 bees from a brood box, washed them, counted the parasites that floated free. The threshold in the ordinance, the level that would have forced Merritt to treat, was 3 mites per 100 bees. He counted Merritt's yard, hive after hive, his hands not quite steady, and the highest count he found in the whole apiary was under 1. He stood there a long time with the clipboard. Then he did the thing that makes him, in the end, not a villain but the truest character in the story, the one who changes. He set the clipboard down on the tailgate of his truck, and he took off his reading glasses, and this time he did not clean them. He just held them. He looked at the yard and at the river bottom he had called a swamp 7 years before, and at the burned barn on the rise with the cellar underneath it, and he asked Merritt a single question in a voice with all the fluency gone out of it. "How?" he said. "Just tell me how." And she told him, not in a speech because she did not have one, but plainly, the way she read a comb. She told him about stopping treatment in 2003, and the 4 out of 5 that died, and the few that lived, and breeding only from those. She told him about the cellar, and the 30 years, and the 1 box that hummed, and this time he did not call it a story, because the Count in his own jars had just told him it was true. She told him that you cannot select for resistance in a population you are protecting from the thing you want it to resist, that every strip he had ever recommended had, with the best intentions in the world, been breeding the very weakness that had just destroyed the best operators in the county. She did not say it to wound him. She said it because he had asked, and because it was the mechanism, and the mechanism was the whole point. Royce listened to all of it standing in the cold, and then he said, "I've had it backward for 20 years. He was not a man who said things like that. The narrator will not pretend it cost him nothing. What he did next is the part that turned a vindication into something larger. He did not slink away. He went back to the state, and he requested, and after a year of fighting, got a redirection of his own program toward survivor stock, and away from the treatment schedule he had built his name on. He came to Merritt formally and asked to study her line, not to absorb it into some 10,000 colony cross, the way he had once told her the answer would have to come, but to learn from what she had done with 11 colonies and a crowbar. He brought students out to the river bottom. He stood in the bee yard he had once dismissed and taught the next generation of state apiarists how to read a comb the way a woman with no degree had read one all along. The county quietly let the inspection ordinance lapse. It had been written to force treatment, and treatment had just failed in front of the entire county, and no one had the stomach to enforce it. Lon did not recover 4,000 colonies. He recovered something better, slowly. He came to Merritt the spring after the collapse, a humbled man with 1,300 surviving colonies and a note at the bank he could no longer service, and he did not apologize, because plain men, like Lon, do not always have the apology in them. Merritt sold him queens at her own cost, not the market price. And more than that, she taught him to graft, so that within 3 years he would not need to buy them at all. He rebuilt his operation on the Cellar line, crossed with his own survivors, treated nothing, and the family he had broken down over at the hearing did not lose the farm. To the bank, his collapse had been a default risk and a restructured note. To Lon, it was the year he stopped fighting the river bottom and started learning from it. To the bees, it was simply the year the strong ones came through, the way they had come through every winter. No one watched, given the chance. Let me be plain about the nephew, because the line had to go forward, and the forward is the point. Merritt had a sister's boy named Peter Higge, 19 the year of the collapse, who had thought his aunt was a stubborn woman wasting good ground on insects, and who came out that winter to see 230 living colonies in the wreck of Lowndes' modern empire, and who asked, the way the young ask when the world has just rearranged itself in front of them, whether he could learn. He did not believe in any famous old line. He believed in what he could see, and what he could see was that his aunt's reckless bees had lived and the careful man's bees had died. That was enough to start. She put a grafting tool in his hand the next spring and showed him how to lift a larva smaller than a grain of rice on the tip of it, and he ruined the first 100 and got the 101st, and by the second summer he could raise a queen. And by the third, he could read a comb in the light and tell her, before she looked, what it said. The check for $48,000 came in 2020 from a breeding cooperative running across 3 states that wanted exclusive access to the Cellar mother line for a season of grafting. Merritt took the money, because money kept the river bottom in the family, and put a new roof on Esther's old farmhouse and bought the boxes Peter would need. She did not call herself wealthy then or ever, and would have walked out of the room if you had used the word da. She set the check under a canning jar so the draft would not move it, and went back out to the yard because the bees did not know about the check and would not have cared. And the work was the same work it had been on the morning she pried open a swollen oak door with a crowbar and went down into the dark. There are 2 kinds of knowing, and this whole story is the long argument between them. There is the wide kind, the kind Royce had, the kind that comes from 10,000 colonies and a budget and a controlled cross and a schedule printed on good paper. The kind that can measure a parasite to the 10th of a milligram and tell you the precise dose to kill it. It is real knowledge, and it is not to be sneered at. And it kept a great many bees alive for a great many years. And there is the narrow kind, the kind Merritt had, the kind that comes from 40 winters on one piece of ground and 3 generations behind it, and the patience to let 4 out of 5 things die in front of you, so that you learn what the fifth one is made of. The wide kind knew everything about the parasite except the one thing that mattered, which was that you cannot defeat a living thing by protecting your bees from it forever. You defeat it by letting your bees learn it. The narrow kind knew that in its bones and could not have written it as an equation to save its life. The barn was never rebuilt. Merritt left the black skeleton standing in the field of burdock because the cellar underneath it was the most valuable thing on the property, and the burned ribs above marked the spot. She wintered bees down there again the old way, carrying the strongest colonies down the 7 stone steps in the late fall and back up in the spring, the way Esther's bees had survived 3 decades of doing for themselves when no one came down to help them. On the last warm afternoon of the autumn, the check arrived. An old gray barn cat named Smoke followed her down the steps the way he always did, and sat on the bottom one with his tail around his feet while she set the boxes on the long wooden rack against the back wall. She put her bare hand flat against the wood of the nearest hive, the way she had 11 years before in the dark, and the wood was warm. Not warm like the sun, warm like a body. She stood there, a moment in the cool, even air with the cat and the humming and the smell of earth and old wax, and then she climbed back up into the light, and she left the door open behind her so the bees could feel the season turn. What is rigid breaks. What learns lasts. What? Esther had been dead a winter when Merritt first went down those stairs, and her bees had outlived her by 30 years and would outlive them all because someone, long before any of them, had simply let them be what they were. A man with 3 degrees had called it the most generous donation the landfill ever received. To the county, it was $140 for a burned barn and a swamp. To the bees, it was the open door at the top of the stairs, and the light, and the long, even dark below where the right ones had always lived.